All right, I just finished the 71 Mustang. Came out real nice. I did this one for a buddy of mine. He bought this at Barrett-Jackson in January, and it's his first classic car. So he didn't really know, what to expect out of driving around a classic car. So he gets in it, and he's used to a new F-150 is what he drives, and so the steering on this car was just all over the place, and it was pretty poorly tuned. So it had some fumes coming out of it, and so he sends me a pretty hilarious video of his first drive. I'll play that for you here.
First ride in the muscle car, ladies and gents. This thing is vibrating and rattling like LL Cool J's Jeep back in the day. Steering may be a little loose, the mirrors may be a little loose, but she's still got class. That's all I gotta say about that.
So when I got it, obviously the steering was the first thing that had to be addressed. He wouldn't even drive it to the shop. I drove it. It was okay. I'm used to classic cars, so I can keep them on the road. But it was pretty bad. Let me show you a little issue we've got here. That sure seems unacceptable. Here's the rag joint moving. Lot of play. Today, I'm going to be swapping it out for this new gearbox and rag joint. And of course, we need the new power steering lines to do that. So, should be pretty fun. Hopefully when it's done, steering will be nice and tight. Alright, here's the new gearbox installed. Came out pretty nice. You can see there's a lot less play to it than it had before. The only modification I made was up here. You can see I used 7/16 bolts to go all the way through, and that's because the 5/16 that it came with isn't enough to get a full grip on that rag joint, and so if it gets loose over time it can develop a decent amount of play. And so I like to do 7/16 so that you can really clamp down on that rag joint. One thing that's kind of cool is these bolts here. These are like little shoulder bolts that hold onto the rag joint, and they tighten down on the gearbox side. And they have these little arms that come out, so in the event that this rag joint fails, these arms will catch the steering arm right here. And that's like a safety upgrade that these old vehicles did not come with. You can see it's a lot tighter than it used to be. So, gonna go take it for a test drive. I'm testing out the new steering, 50 miles an hour, straight as can be. A lot nicer. After we did that, then I had to address the tuning issue, and this was a bit of a doozy. First thing that it felt like the timing was off, and so I looked at the timing, and it was somewhere around 12 degrees ahead of top dead center. It was so far that it was well off the markings on the harmonic balancer, and there was a little bit of a clatter out of the front of the engine, and so I thought probably that it had skipped a tooth, or that the chain was just really worn, and that once I fixed the timing chain, I figured then I could get the timing spot on. So I reluctantly pulled the front of the motor apart, and then I found out, yeah, that sure enough, the chain was just super loosey-goosey in there. And so after replacing the chain, I thought, well, let me look at the timing marks and see how they line up. And so I put the timing marker and then a harmonic balancer on, and it was the wrong harmonic balancer because the markings were off by about 30 degrees. And so I've seen that before on the Chevys, where they put a new timing cover on, and the new timing cover has a different location for the timing marks because a different year uses a different harmonic balancer, and they don't change one or the other, and so the marks are always off. And you can get away with that if it's already tuned, and then you just replace the harmonic balancer, but you can't retune it at that point. You can never change a distributor because you're going to have to do it by ear, and you'll never get it where it needs to be. So I ordered a new harmonic balancer. I threw it on. Timing marks lined up perfectly right at 0 degrees. So I throw it all together, fire it up, and we were at 30 degrees advanced timing, static. And so that was why I couldn't keep the vacuum line for the distributor advance couldn't be hooked up, because it would advance it too far and it would start dying. And so I was able to put it back to 6 degrees before top dead center. Started running way better the whole way. As I'm moving the distributor, it's just running better and better and better. Get it set right at 6 degrees and it's just nice and smooth. And so I then hook up the vacuum advance and check the total timing with the centrifugal and the vacuum, and we are 34 degrees, exactly within spec on where this motor is supposed to be. All right, I'm getting ready to install the subframes on the 71 Mustang convertible, and I'm going to show you why this is so important. So this is the door gap. I'm going to lift it up on the lift here, and watch this change. You see how much that's spread out? And that's just from the weight that's on each side of the lift, of where it's lifting. So all the front engine weight and all the rear suspension weight. And so I took the measurements of it. It's about 4 millimeters on each side from here to here that it opens up when it's lifted up. So hopefully when these subframes are in, that'll be a little bit less. We'll definitely get less twisting out of it, but this isn't a high horsepower application, so that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue we're having is drivability with it right now. So hopefully this will stabilize it up a little bit. So I'll go ahead and install them and then show you what it looks like. All right, I've got the subframes all welded in. It came out pretty nice. Here's the other side. Let me back up a little bit. So that should add some strength, mounting the front subframe to the rear subframe together. Alright, I'm working on the front suspension. This is a kit from CJ Pony Parts. It's a pretty good kit. This is how it's looking right now. This is the side that I haven't worked on. The control arms, the springs, the shocks, everything was in pretty good shape. At some point somebody had upgraded the bushings to the polyurethane style. Now this side I've already done, and it has the rubber bushings. I'll show them to you on the table in a second. I actually like them much better. Comes with a new lower control arm, upper control arm, coil mount, the shock absorber, and then all the steering components. So it's a pretty awesome kit. So here's the old bushing, and here's the new one. Okay, and there's a few changes here. If you notice, the washer for the polyurethane one on one side is the same size, and on the other it's a little bit bigger, and so that allows that sleeve to get pushed through so you can clamp it down. But once it is clamped down, there's not a lot of give to it, and so over time these do seem to wear out pretty bad. Now the rubber ones, they have their own issues where the rubber deteriorates, and obviously that's an issue, but the sleeves that they use on each side are a lot better at mating to the nut. And then if you see, they're in there a pretty good amount, and so it clamps down on the front subframe, and then when you're tightening it down, these bushings actually press in, and so you get about, however much that is, 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 of deflection on each side to really clamp it down, and then it holds it all together. And one of the nice things about having that sleeve is you can see on the other side, you can see how that nut is just jammed up against that washer, so you're getting a lot of wear on that. So the new setup, you can see here's the sleeve, much nicer, much nicer. So should be a lot less squeaky too. So we'll see. Oh, before I forget, check this out. Here's the new sway bar. So you've got the old sway bar, obviously is the small one in the front, and then the new sway bar, much beefier. So that should help a lot. So here's the carb. You can see it's been replaced somewhat recently. It's a good carb, but it's way too much for this motor, especially because it's only had the intake done. And my buddy is having an issue with it where if it sits too long, because we live in Arizona, all the fuel evaporates out of the bowl, and then the mechanical pump is having a hard time filling up the fuel line, and it will not start. And because this is not his daily driver, especially in the middle of summer, he has decided he wants fuel injection.
So I have the FITECH fuel injection kit. This is the 400 horsepower one because the motor is not super powerful. It's probably somewhere in the mid 200 range. So this will be more than enough. And then I've got the high pressure fuel line with some of the cool guy fittings. And that is what I'll be installing today. All right, the wiring and the plumbing are all done, ready to fire up the FITECH. And I did have to do a new fuel level sending unit, and so I had to pull the tank on this. So there's no fuel at all in the system. And so I had this unplugged until just now because I didn't want it to drain while I was waiting on the parts. And here's an interesting thing about the FITECH systems. When you turn the key into the on position, it's going to prime the pump for 3 seconds, so the pump will run to try to fill up pressure, and then it'll squirt a little bit of fuel into the throttle body. And I do not want it to squirt any fuel into the throttle body because what I want to do is turn it on and off a couple of times to prime it and get all the air out of the system. So the little trick on the FITECHs, if you don't want it to keep squirting fuel into them, it has a throttle positioning sensor. So you just push the throttle down, it'll recognize that your foot is on the accelerator, and then when you turn the key, I don't know if you can hear it, but it's priming up, but it's not going to be squirting fuel, hopefully. So I'll do that 3 times. And it's hard to, I don't know if you can hear or not, but I can hear it priming, and you can hear a little tone change as soon as it recognizes that it's got pressure. So as soon as the air's gone. So I'm going to go to the initial setup, engine setup. I can't remember if I had this set up or not. Let's see here. This is similar. It's a 351. It's mild cam. It's stock. You're going to drop the rev limiter because it is stock. I do not want it going past 5,000. You can change that later if we want to. 800 for warm, that sounds good, and 74% for the fuel pump. That all looks good. So I'll put the key in the on position. This time my foot is off the gas, so it does squirt a little fuel in there. Let's make sure. Okay, so it's recognizing ECU, and let's fire up. Make sure it's in park. Everything's good. All right, let's go. Dang. Okay. Let's double check real quick here at the dashboard. See how everything's looking. I'm just going to let it run for just a second, and then I'm going to check for leaks. Boy, it looks good. Wow, you see the air-fuel ratio in the center there? 14.5. And then you see the target air-fuel ratio. And look at that. Look how quickly it adjusted. All right, let's go ahead and turn it off. Check for leaks. Good. Good. Anything out of the back there? Good. All right, I'll be able to fire it up and let it start the tuning process.
That's how I got the motor all tuned up. That went really well. And then as far as the transmission goes, we had a C4 factory 3-speed, and he wanted a little more fun out of it. So I contacted Monster Transmission, and they made us an AOD conversion kit. Really nice kit. And luckily, we had the long tail C4, so it was 31 inches, give or take, in total length, and the AOD was 31 inches. So miraculously, the rear drive shaft lined up perfectly.
And the only difference was it needs a much smaller slip yoke. And then, in my storage, I found this little guy. I believe it was from the back of a T5 transmission on a Cobra replica. But it's a proper 28 spine, 1.5 slip yoke. So I'm going to pop these U-joints out and see if they're the same size. We might get lucky, and it might all fit together.
Also, I was told that I wouldn't be able to use the transmission mount, but I found that the AOD pan was much farther back, and so it interfered with it. But I was able to just cut and modify the factory transmission mount and reuse it, which is really nice. Once we had the AOD in it, obviously we've got a really high overdrive. It's something like 0.67 or 0.68 to 1 overdrive, and it had 241 rear gears. So I don't even know what the theoretical top speed of that, like gear-wise, would have been, but it would have been ridiculous. And the cruising RPMs would have been, 1,400, 1,200, or whatever on the freeway. So I was able to go with 370 gears for the rear. And while we had it open, I figured now's the time for Positrax.
Oh yeah.
It's all done. It's a fantastic car. It's going to be a lot of fun for him. And it's a good first classic car for him too.
So I have an update on this Mustang. I ended up filming this and finishing it up about a month ago, but I waited to release this because I wanted to make sure that everything was dialed in and I didn't need to do any more work to it. The ride on it was still pretty rough. The subframe ended up helping with the deflection. If you remember the door, how it was separating 4 millimeters, it took out about two of those. So the deflection was about half of where it was before, but the front control arms only had about a half an inch of space before they were hitting the bump stops. I actually couldn't fit my finger through there. So every bump that this thing hit on the road, it was just rattling down the road. So it was nice on smooth roads, but any curbs, potholes were the worst with it. So I ended up taking it back to the shop and I took off the cut coils. They were factory coils that had been cut, and then I put on the factory height coils from the CJ Pony Parts kit that was the whole front end. So I did make a video that shows how I did it, because I had to modify the coil spring compressor because they just don't work super great. So you'll see here what I had to do with the suspension, but other than that, everything on it was good to go. So here's the suspension, and that's it. Right now I'm doing the front suspension. What happened was that somebody got a little squirrely with a grinder and they cut a little bit too much off of the coils. So the one on the right is the coil I removed from the driver's side, the one on the left is the new one for the passenger side. And you can see it's been cut. I don't know if you can tell, but it's been grinded down. And it looks like they only cut about 3/4 of a coil, and then it also settled a little bit, but the car was basically riding on the bump stops. Now this is very difficult on these old Mustangs because the coils ride on top of the upper control arm up here, and they are extremely difficult to get them stuffed in there. So I thought I would just show you guys a little trick that I've got. So here is an internal coil compressor. So this usually goes right here, and then you slide it into the middle of a coil, and each side hooks on, and then when this screws in, it compresses the two. What I did, I took this is 11 gauge, so it's 1/8 of an inch thick all the way around rectangular tubing, so that I can then send it through the center of the coil like this, and then this plate on the top allows me to compress it much farther than I would normally be able to. So that's my little trick. I'll show you how it looks when I get it set up here. So here it is all hooked up. You can see how the bolts are a little offset, and so the lower bolt goes to the lower side of the coil. I've got it as pretty low. I could go a little bit lower, but I want to keep a little bit of thread showing so that once this compresses and then I remove the upper control arm and then you're releasing it, what you don't want to have happen is have it be so compressed that as you release it, you run out of threads and the bottom pops off, because then the coil will pop out with extreme force. So this is what the top is looking like. Real simple. It just has to be a plate that is thick enough so that it will not deform and that it can hold on to the bucket here. So now I'm just going to tighten this down. It's going to compress this coil. The coil will go up. The control arm will be popped out. I'll put the new coil in, reverse it. I'll pull it up with the same setup here, and then I'll get the control arm back in, and then I'll release the pressure. So that's my little system. I'm certain I'm not the only guy that has done this or thought of it, but it is a cheap and easy way to make coil spring installations go a little bit smoother, because I hate using coil compressors. So here we go. Here it is, all compressed. You can see that the coil is no longer touching the control arm here. And so I'm going to take out the 2 bolts to hold in the upper control arm, pull the upper control arm out, swing it off to the side on the the top ball joint here, and then I'll be able to loosen this clamp and pull the old spring out. So here's the brand new coil ready to go, and you notice how these little hooks, this is the farthest down that I could get them. Now when I'm installing it, I can obviously go as low on these coils as I want, because when it compresses and I fit the control arm in there and then release it, it's going to release up against the lower control arm. So I'm trying to get these as low as possible, and that's the farthest I can get it. So I'm going to go ahead and compress it now and then get that control arm back in there. Here it is with the upper control arm back in. You can see how tight the windings are at the top, and you can see how much of this bolt is left, showing how much that spring compressed. Boy, even with that, it was still a pain to get the sucker in. But it's all in now, and all I have to do is unscrew that, pull it out from the top, and put this sucker back together.